The story of our species is written in dust. Not the kind that gathers on shelves or drifts lazily in beams of sunlight, but dust older than memory, older than language, older than the shape of the continents themselves. This is the dust of eroded mountains, volcanic ash, and the pulverized bones of creatures whose names have never been spoken. Somewhere within that dust, our beginnings are scattered, and in places, entirely missing. Imagine standing on the edge of a canyon at dawn. The rock layers stretch beneath your feet like the pages of an ancient book, each band of color a chapter in Earth's biography. Some pages are thick with detail, shells pressed into limestone, the impression of a fern in shale, the clean edge of a volcanic layer telling of a single violent day. But then, there is a gap, a section torn away, the story interrupted. No matter how far you lean over the edge, the missing part of the book is gone. This is the 1 million-year gap in human history. It sits between the known worlds of our past like an ocean between continents. Before it, we have the slow rise of early humans, primitive tools, fire perhaps tamed in isolated places, migrations etched faintly into the soil. After it, we see the stirrings of something new, sharper tools, hints of language, and the first glimmers of symbolic thought. But in between, silence. Not the silence of peace or rest, but the silence of an unrecorded age. No cities, no carved stones, no art scratched into cave walls. It is as if humanity walked into a long shadow, and for 1 million years we disappeared from the record. Scientists can name the bones that bookend this gap. They can trace the shape of skulls, measure the wear on ancient teeth, and catalog the crude tools left scattered across old riverbeds. But between those bookends lies a void wide enough to hold countless stories, and yet, it holds nothing. No matter how we dig, sift, and scan, the middle of the story refuses to show itself. What happened there? Was it an age of hardship when survival swallowed every moment of the day, leaving no time for innovation? Did entire branches of the human family tree vanish, leaving no descendants to tell their tales? Or was it something else, a slow drift through landscapes so vast and changing that every trace of life was swept away by wind, water, and time? Archaeology is a conversation with the dead, but here, the dead will not speak. We find a flake of stone in one place, a fragment of bone in another, but the trail between them is broken. Our ancestors may have walked continents, fought predators, loved, mourned, and dreamed under the same stars we see tonight, but their world is almost completely unlit to us. And yet, there's something almost magnetic about a silence this large. The absence itself becomes a kind of presence. It forces us to look harder, to imagine deeper, to see the human story not just as a series of inventions and wars and empires, but as a fragile thread that could have snapped at any time. The dust of forgotten ages does not give up its secrets easily. You can stand in a wind-blown desert where the earth is older than humanity, hold a shard of stone in your hand, and know that the person who shaped it lived before everything we call history. They had no writing, no farming, no nation, but they had a mind like yours. They could plan, they could fear, they could hope. And then, like a tide slipping out to sea, they and their kind vanished into the gap. This documentary is not about filling that gap with certainty. It is about walking its edges, tracing the shadows that fall across it, and asking why it exists at all. We will follow the bones and the stones, but also the firelight of speculation, because sometimes, the questions are more revealing than the answers. Before we step forward, picture the earth as it was then. Vast herds of strange beasts roam plains that are now buried beneath cities. Rivers run where deserts now bake under relentless sun. Glaciers stretch their white fingers down from the poles, carving valleys that will one day cradle forests. And somewhere in that shifting world, small bands of humans, not yet us, but carrying the seeds of us, move like whispers through the landscape. The 1 million-year gap is not just a hole in history. It is a reminder that most of human existence is invisible to us. We live in a thin slice of time where information flows freely and memory is stored in silicon, stone, and paper. But in the deep past, memory had only one vessel, the human mind, and minds do not fossilize. If there is a truth waiting in the dust, it will be hard won. We will have to move slowly, as the earth itself does, layer by layer. We will walk through vanished forests, feel the heat of ancient summers, and stand in the cold winds of ice ages long past. And with every step, we will search for the faint traces of lives that ended tens of thousands of generations ago. This is the opening of our journey, into a shadow so long it spans 1 million years, into a silence that speaks louder than words. And somewhere deep in that silence, the story of who we are waits to be told. History is not a straight line. It is more like a torn and patched quilt, some pieces vivid and detailed, others faded beyond recognition, and many missing entirely. To understand the million-year gap, we first have to place our hands on the pieces that remain, to see where the fabric of our story is still whole. Scientists speak of the archaeological record as if it were a continuous scroll, but in truth, it's a fragile mosaic. Each shard we have is a moment when the past and the present briefly touched, a fossil in the ground, a stone tool in the dirt, a scrap of DNA preserved against all odds. These fragments form the edges of our map, the boundaries of the time we can see. On one side of the gap lies a world of persistence. Roughly 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus roamed Africa, Asia, and parts of Europe. They were master survivors, the first humans to stride fully upright, the first to expand far beyond the cradle of Africa, the first to wield fire in some regions. Their tools, though simple by our standards, represented a leap in thinking. A hand axe is not just a rock, it is a plan held in the mind, a shape imagined before it exists. We know them through the things they left behind in ancient riverbeds and volcanic plains, symmetrical stone blades, butchered animal bones, the charred remains of campfires. These artifacts tell us that before the gap, human ancestors were capable of long-term survival, migration, and adaptation. The map of their presence stretches from the savannas of East Africa to the grasslands of China. On the other side of the gap, around 300,000 years ago, the world changes again. The fossils become more recognizably like us, Homo sapiens in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia. The tools are sharper, more varied, more sophisticated. Stone is flaked with precision. Pigments hint at early symbolic behavior. Some sites show evidence of shelters and controlled hearths, not just fire found, but fire mastered. Between these 2 points, the world of Homo erectus and the dawn of Homo sapiens, there is a missing continent of time. A million years in which something must have happened, but the record is thin, scattered, and often maddeningly incomplete. Picture our map as an old parchment. The coastlines before the gap are inked in with care. We can trace migration routes, the spread of tool types, and the locations of key fossils. After the gap, new lands emerge, symbolic thinking, social complexity, perhaps even the first stirrings of language. But the middle? The middle is blank ocean, dotted with a few lonely islands. Those islands are tantalizing. A fossilized skull here, a tool assemblage there. Each find is like a lighthouse in the dark, casting a narrow beam across the waters of time. Yet, no matter how we connect them, there are vast stretches between where the light does not reach. This is the problem with deep time. The further we look back, the more the record crumbles, until we're trying to reconstruct a novel from 3 scattered sentences. The edges of the map are also where science meets humility. We like to think we can reconstruct the past with precision, but even our clearest fossil horizons are snapshots taken millions of years after the fact. Sediments shift, bones erode, rivers flood and wash artifacts away. Sometimes, the evidence never stood a chance of surviving. Organic materials like wood, leather, and plant fibers, the stuff of everyday life, almost never endure from such deep antiquity. And yet, those edges still speak. They tell us that before the gap, humans were already global wanderers in their own way. They had learned to endure shifting climates, to cross mountains and rivers, to hunt and scavenge in ecosystems utterly foreign to us. After the gap, we see humans who not only survived but shaped their world, napping stone with artistry, perhaps singing or telling stories around the fire, and building social bonds that stretched beyond blood. Standing here with 1 foot on each edge, the question looms larger. What happened in between? How do you go from the steady, enduring presence of Homo erectus to the sudden flowering of complex behaviors we see later? Was it a slow, invisible evolution, or a series of sharp, defining events? The metaphor of a map is useful but misleading in one way. It tempts us to think of the missing space as empty. In truth, the million-year gap was almost certainly filled with life, dense, tangled, and changing. Our ancestors didn't stop walking, hunting, loving, fearing, or dying during that time. They simply walked beyond the reach of the ink. The known edges also serve another purpose in our journey. They give us a frame. Without a frame, the gap is just a void. With a frame, it becomes a mystery. And mysteries invite pursuit. As we step away from the edges and prepare to sail into the blank space, we must carry these images with us. The steady gaze of Homo erectus, watching the sun set over a savanna that no longer exists, the flicker of controlled firelight 300,000 years ago, casting shadows over the faces of humans who could almost be mistaken for us. These are the anchor points of our story, the last firm ground before the leap. In the next stretch, we will enter the silence itself, listening for the faintest echoes that might bridge the two worlds. But before we do, take a moment to stand here, on the cliff edge of time, and look across that vast and empty sea. Somewhere out there, 1,000,000 years are waiting. The earth keeps secrets well. It buries them under layers of sediment, locks them away in caves, scatters them in riverbeds, or swallows them beneath the ocean floor. Archaeology is the act of coaxing those secrets back into the light. But there are times, and the 1,000,000-year gap is one of them, when the earth refuses to speak at all. Stand on an excavation site from the right period, and you can feel the silence physically. The layers above and below may be rich with history, tools, bones, even traces of hearths and shelter. But the layer that should hold the heart of the gap often offers nothing but stone, sand, and dust. It is not just an empty page, it is a page scraped clean. For archaeologists, this is maddening. In more recent eras, you can trace cultures from pottery shards, ruins, and burial sites. Even tens of thousands of years back, you can find rock art, beads, or tools. But here, the record grows thin. Every new dig in this time frame is a gamble. Will it yield a clue, or will it give only the indifferent face of stone? The silence is made more haunting by its unevenness. In certain rare places, an artifact will emerge from the darkness, a flint blade, a fossilized bone, a lone heartbeat in an otherwise still landscape. These finds are so rare that each one can rewrite whole theories. And yet, they are isolated, like single stars scattered across a dark sky. We can see them, but we cannot easily draw the constellations between them. Why is the silence so deep? One reason is preservation bias, the brutal truth that most of what humans made and used in that time was perishable. A spear shaft of wood, a woven grass basket, a leather sling, all would have decayed within centuries. Only stone, bone, and the occasional charred remains of fire had a chance to survive for 1,000,000 years. Even then, erosion, water, and seismic shifts often erased them completely. But there is another, more sobering possibility. Perhaps there really was less to preserve. Perhaps human populations were so small, so widely scattered, that they left only the faintest fingerprint on the earth. A handful of camps here, a small hunting party there. Whole generations might have lived and died without leaving a single artifact that would survive to our time. If that is the case, then the silence is not a trick of preservation, it is a reflection of how precarious our existence once was. Imagine a world where every human alive could fit inside a single modern stadium, and still leave empty seats. Now imagine those humans spread thinly over thousands of miles, each group never knowing the others even existed. That is the scale we may be dealing with. The stones do not speak, but they hint. A scatter of tools in East Africa, another in the Levant, another in India, like footprints emerging briefly in mud before vanishing into the grass. Geologists can date the layers, match them to climatic shifts, even identify the types of stone used. But the context is missing. Who made these tools? Were they the same people across generations, or different species altogether? Did knowledge pass from hand to hand, or was it reinvented each time from scratch? It is here, in this void, that the imagination begins to strain against the limits of fact. We can picture a small band of humans huddled in the mouth of a cave, the wind howling outside, napping stone by firelight. We can imagine them telling stories, not with words as we know them, but with gestures, with shared memories of a hunt or a journey. But we cannot prove they did. All we have is a shard of stone, its edge still sharp after 1,000,000 years, whispering that someone was here. The silence has another effect, it pulls us inward. In eras where the record is rich, the focus is outward, on the events, the inventions, the cultures. In the gap, the focus shifts to survival itself. We start asking not, what did they build, but, how did they endure? And endurance leaves fewer monuments. For some, this emptiness is frustrating. For others, it is where the real beauty lies. There is something profound in the idea that for most of our history, we lived in ways that left no grand legacy except our own continued existence. No pyramids, no cities, no written words, just the passing on of life from one generation to the next. The stones, in their silence, remind us that history is biased toward the loud, the builders, the makers, the painters. But survival is often quiet. It is walking a long distance for water. It is knowing which berries to eat and which to avoid. It is finding shelter before the storm comes. These acts leave no mark that time can hold on to. Yet without them, nothing else in history would exist. Some archaeologists have described working in this period as listening for a whisper in a hurricane. You dig for months, sometimes years, and find nothing that ties directly to human hands. And then one day, you turn over a spall of stone and realize it has a deliberate edge. It is as if the past reached forward and tapped you on the shoulder, just for a moment. That is why the silence, though daunting, is not hopeless. It forces patience. It demands humility. And it sharpens the value of each discovery, however small. A single stone flake, in this context, can tell us that humans were here, at this place, at this time, in the vast, unrecorded middle of their journey. We stand now in that silence, at the very heart of the gap. Ahead lies the task of trying to understand why this million-year desert exists in our record. But first, we must accept that the stones will not give up their secrets easily, and that perhaps, part of the story will always remain in shadow. In the next chapter, we will step back in time to meet the humans who lived just before the gap began, the last clear voices before the long quiet fell. Before the silence fell, there were people. Not quite us, but close enough that if one were to walk past you on a dim street at night, you might notice something strange in their face, a heavier brow, a broader nose, but still see the unmistakable spark of human life in their eyes. These were our ancestors, the last fully visible figures before the record faded into a million years of shadow. The name we give them is Homo erectus, upright man, though the name is misleading in its simplicity. They were not the first to stand tall, nor the first to walk great distances, but they were the first to combine those traits with an endurance that defied extinction for nearly 2 million years. By the time the gap begins, they had already spread farther than any human species before them. Imagine an open savanna in East Africa, 2 million years ago. The sun is low, casting long golden light over the grass. A small group moves through the landscape, men, women, children, all walking with the same easy, ground-eating stride you see in distance runners today. They carry little. A few stone tools tucked into belts of hide, perhaps a spear with a hardened wooden tip. Their wealth is not in possessions, but in knowledge, the paths of migrating herds, the location of waterholes, the moods of the sky before a storm. Their faces are not ours, but they are not alien. The brow ridges are prominent, the jaw strong, the brain slightly smaller than ours, but far larger than earlier hominins. That brain-powered skills no other creature possessed, the ability to plan for a hunt days in advance, to imagine a tool before shaping it, to cooperate with others toward a shared goal. Homo erectus were the masters of the Acheulean hand axe, a teardrop-shaped tool that could skin an animal, cut wood, and dig for roots. Each one took skill to make, striking flakes from stone at just the right angles to create a symmetrical, balanced edge. The very symmetry speaks to a mind capable of more than brute survival. It suggests a sense of pattern, of intention, maybe even of aesthetics. Some evidence hints they controlled fire, though perhaps not everywhere or all the time. Where they did, it would have transformed their nights, keeping predators at bay, making food safer to eat, extending the hours they could spend together. Around a fire, they may have shared knowledge, though what form their communication took is lost to us. We do not know if they spoke in words, in gestures, in rhythmic sounds, only that they could pass skills from one generation to the next. Their range was astonishing. Fossils and tools place them across Africa, into the Middle East, across Asia, and as far as the islands of Indonesia. To reach some of these islands, they may have crossed water, whether on rafts, by swimming, or via land bridges during low sea levels. However they managed it, they were not bound by a single continent. They had begun humanity's long habit of exploration. And yet, for all their resilience, they lived in a world of constant risk. The landscapes they crossed were home to predators far more dangerous than any today: saber-toothed cats, massive hyenas, giant snakes, crocodiles large enough to swallow a person whole. Even a simple hunt could be deadly. A misjudged throw of a spear, a slip in rocky terrain, a gash from an animal's tusk could mean infection and death. There were no doctors, no medicines beyond what could be found in plants and herbs. We can guess at their social structure from modern hunter-gatherers and from the needs of survival. Small bands of 20 to 40 individuals, perhaps loosely connected to other bands, likely shared food and protected one another. The young learned by imitation, the elders carried the memory of good seasons and bad, the locations of resources, and the signs of danger. For Homo erectus, the world was not divided into wild and home, it was all one vast living system, and they were a part of it. The rivers that fed them also fed the predators. The plains that gave them game could dry into dust. The forests could burn in lightning storms. Every movement through the land was a negotiation with forces far larger than themselves. And yet, they endured. For hundreds of thousands of years, their way of life persisted with only gradual changes in tools and techniques. If you stepped into their world at any point in that span, you would find a life recognizably human in rhythm, hunting, gathering, resting, repairing tools, tending fire, raising children. It was a life without written history, without art as we know it, but not without meaning. Meaning was in the daily act of survival, in the bonds between people, in the slow passing of seasons. Then something happened, or perhaps many things. Climate began to shift in dramatic ways. Ice ages waxed and waned. Rainfall patterns changed, sometimes turning grasslands into deserts or swamping them into wetlands. Food sources moved or vanished. Populations thinned. By the time the gap fully swallows the record, Homo erectus is still out there, but the trail grows faint. Their tools appear less frequently in the sediment. Fossils are rarer. It is as if their voices are receding, growing quieter with each passing millennium. And so we stand here, at the last clear moment before the long silence begins. On one side, a people whose endurance defied the odds, whose feet shaped trails across continents. On the other, a million years of near vanishing, a stretch of time in which even these hardy survivors fade into the background of history. In the next section, we will step into that shadowed expanse, searching for signs of catastrophe, the kind of events that could have erased so much of our story. The earth is not a gentle storyteller. Sometimes it turns the page with the slow patience of erosion. Other times, it rips whole chapters away in a single violent motion. And in the million-year gap, there are signs, faint but undeniable, that nature may have torn at our history with both hands. Imagine a clear blue sky over a lush plain. It is morning, the air is warm, the horizon open. Then, without warning, the day goes dark. Not with nightfall, but with a shroud of ash. A volcano 1,000 miles away has split the earth open. Its roar has traveled faster than the smoke, carried by the wind like the voice of a god. Soon, fine gray powder drifts down, coating leaves, waterholes, skin. The sun becomes a dim, cold coin behind a curtain. The plants wither, the prey animals weaken, and the hunters, human and animal alike, begin to starve. Volcanic winters like this have happened before, and the geological record shows they can last for years. Ash in the atmosphere reflects sunlight back into space, cooling the Earth's surface. Even tropical regions can suffer frost. Crops, if they exist, fail. In a hunter-gatherer world, the entire food chain buckles. The 1 million year gap may hide more than one such disaster. Volcanoes were not the only culprits. The ice ages, relentless, cyclical, and unforgiving, reshaped continents and erased habitats. Glaciers the size of countries ground their way across the land, carving valleys, rerouting rivers, and locking water into frozen walls hundreds of meters high. When the ice advanced, sea levels fell, revealing new landscapes, but also turning lush coasts into barren expanses. When it retreated, seas rose, swallowing the places where people once lived, taking their traces with it. Between these frozen periods were times of sudden heat. Climate did not shift gently, it lurched. In a few centuries, rainfall patterns could reverse. Green lands could become deserts, and deserts could bloom into grasslands. For small human populations, these swings were lethal. A group adapted to hunting reindeer on open tundra could find itself in dense forest within a few generations, its skills suddenly obsolete. Then there were the skies. The Earth has been struck before, by asteroids and comets large enough to alter global climate. A single impact can throw billions of tons of dust into the atmosphere, dimming the sun for years. While we have no definitive crater dated precisely to the million-year gap, smaller but still devastating impacts could have gone unnoticed in the fossil record, their scars hidden under later geological changes. Each of these events would have been a trial by fire, ice, or shadow. For the humans alive then, survival would have meant more than skill, it would have required luck. Entire clans could vanish in a single bad season. Knowledge could be lost when elders died before passing it on. Tools, hunting methods, even spoken words could disappear, leaving no trace but silence. Some scientists believe that population bottlenecks, sharp drops in numbers, punctuated this period. The evidence is written not in artifacts, but in our DNA. Reduced genetic diversity in certain parts of the human genome suggests that, at times, all of humanity may have been reduced to just a few thousand breeding individuals. Imagine the entire species balanced on the knife's edge of extinction, clinging to survival in scattered pockets across Africa and Eurasia. In those moments, the world must have felt vast and empty. Days could pass without seeing another group of humans. The sounds of the wild, the cry of birds, the howl of predators, would have been louder than the sound of human voices. Every journey into new territory would be a step into the unknown, where the difference between a safe water source and a poisoned one could mean the survival or death of your people. It is tempting to see these catastrophes only as destruction, but they were also sculptors. Harsh environments select for resilience, adaptability, and creativity. A volcanic winter could force humans to broaden their diet, to invent new ways to hunt or store food. A sudden drought could drive migration, leading to encounters, and perhaps interbreeding, with other human species. In the crucible of disaster, traits that helped survival would spread, shaping the humans who eventually emerged after the gap. And perhaps the most enduring mark of these catastrophes was psychological. Imagine growing up in a world where the sky could darken for years, where the land could freeze without warning, where the animals you relied on could vanish forever. Such a world breeds caution, cooperation, and perhaps the beginnings of the stories we still tell, stories of floods, of fire, of endless winter. Myths may be the echo of events so ancient we cannot name them, carried in memory through countless retellings. We will never know every trial our ancestors faced in those million years. The earth has buried too much, erased too many lines from the page. But the scars remain, in the landscapes carved by ice, in the layers of ash trapped deep in sediment, in the patterns of our own DNA. They are faint signatures of times when survival was not a given, but a rare and precious victory. As we leave this chapter, one thing is clear: the gap was not empty. It was a gauntlet, a series of challenges so severe that only the most adaptable survive. And when we pick up the trail again after the silence, the humans we find are not the same as those who entered it. They are sharper, more inventive, and, perhaps, more aware of how fragile life can be. In the next section, we will look not at the forces of nature, but at the human cost, the vanishing populations whose bloodlines ended forever in the long night of the gap. When we talk about extinction, we often think of entire species disappearing in a single catastrophic moment. But in the long, grinding timeline of human evolution, extinction could also come quietly, not with a bang, but with the slow, silent fading of one group after another, until only a handful remained. In the million-year gap, the Earth was not just reshaping landscapes, it was thinning the ranks of humanity itself. Population bottlenecks, those moments when numbers collapse to a fraction of what they once were, are written into our DNA. They are the genetic shadows of near-extinction events, and they tell a chilling story. At certain points in our past, all the humans on Earth may have numbered fewer than 10,000 individuals. That is smaller than many modern towns. Imagine the entire species living in scattered bands, each isolated from the others, each unaware that somewhere far beyond the horizon, another group like them still clung to survival. The causes were many. Climate chaos could strip a region of food in just a few seasons. A volcanic winter might freeze the savannas, driving herds to migrate beyond reach. Drought could shrink rivers to muddy trickles, making once rich hunting grounds barren. And for a small group of humans, these changes didn't just mean hunger, they meant the collapse of everything familiar. When resources dwindled, groups splintered. Families split apart in search of food, knowing they might never reunite. The smaller the population, the more fragile it became. A single harsh winter, a disease spreading through a camp, or an unlucky encounter with predators could wipe out an entire lineage. The knowledge that group carried, the locations of waterholes, the techniques for shaping a particular kind of tool, the memory of a safe migration route, would vanish with them. These were the unrecorded endings of human cultures, lost forever to the silence of the gap. Some groups likely died out without ever seeing another human face outside their own kin. Their world was small, perhaps only a few square miles they knew intimately, and beyond that lay uncertainty. To leave meant risking the unknown. To stay meant risking starvation. It was a choice repeated over and over in the deep past, and for many, there was no right answer. For those who survived, the emotional cost must have been immense. We cannot know their thoughts, but we can imagine the strain. The loss of a child or a hunter was not just grief, it could mean the difference between eating and going hungry, between surviving the winter or not. Death was not a rare interruption to life, it was a constant shadow. Isolation also had other costs. Small populations mean less genetic diversity, and with it, greater vulnerability to disease and inherited weaknesses. Over time, this could weaken a group's resilience, making them even more susceptible to the next environmental shift. A vicious cycle, fewer people leading to less adaptability leading to fewer people, could continue until the last member of a lineage was gone. And yet, somehow, some survived. The survivors may have done so by chance, living in a region spared the worst of a climate swing, or by skill, exploiting resources others ignored. Some may have been unusually adaptable, able to change hunting strategies, diet, and territory in response to new challenges. It's possible that cooperation between groups, rare though it might have been, was a deciding factor, a sharing of resources or mates that kept genetic diversity from collapsing entirely. These survivors carried forward more than just their genes. They carried fragments of knowledge, techniques, and perhaps even oral traditions, a way of shaping stone, a hunting method for a particular animal, a route across dangerous terrain. These fragments, passed through generations, could resurface hundreds of thousands of years later in the hands of their descendants. But for every survivor, there were countless others whose stories ended. We will never know their names, their languages, the small joys or tragedies of their lives. They are absent from our maps and our museums, existing only as statistical ghosts in genetic data. And yet, without their struggles, and the lessons learned in their failures, the humans who emerged after the gap might not have been the same. Some scientists believe that these bottlenecks shaped us profoundly. When populations are small, certain traits can spread rapidly, not just physical traits, but behavioral ones. Adaptability, cooperation, curiosity, these may have been sharpened by the long grind of survival in the gap. The humans who stepped out on the other side were, in this view, forged in fire, the descendants of those who could endure scarcity, isolation, and change. It is worth remembering that in such small populations, everyone mattered. Every skilled hunter, every elder with memory of a migration route, every child who might grow to carry the lineage forward, all were vital. Losing even one person could alter the fate of the entire group. In this way, the million-year gap was a crucible not just for evolution, but for the human sense of value and interdependence. If we could stand beside one of those groups at the height of the gap, we might see resilience in its rawest form. No grand tools or monuments, no art carved in stone, just people, watchful and lean, their lives a daily negotiation with an unforgiving world. They would not know they were living in what we now call a gap. For them, life was simply the way it had always been, hard, uncertain, precious. As we leave this chapter, one fact becomes clear. The million-year gap was not a time when humanity stood still. It was a time when humanity nearly vanished. The thin thread that carried us through was stretched to breaking, and yet, somehow, it did not snap. In the next section, we will turn from the visible traces, the shrinking populations, the genetic bottlenecks, to the invisible record carried inside us, the clues hidden in our own DNA that whisper of forgotten ancestors and ghost lineages. The stones may be silent, but our blood remembers. Every living human carries within their cells an unbroken chain of life stretching back through the million-year gap, through countless generations, through deaths and births beyond counting. Most of that chain is invisible to us, but in the last few decades, science has learned to read it like a palimpsest, uncovering faint and ancient traces of people who have otherwise vanished. Our DNA is not a perfect record, it is a living one, constantly edited by mutation, recombination, and chance. But certain patterns survive for tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years. By comparing the genomes of people across the world, scientists can look for divergences, points where two populations split from a common ancestor, and for convergences, where previously separate groups interbred. When we turn that lens on the million-year gap, strange things emerge. The first revelation is that our family tree is less a neat branching diagram and more a dense, tangled thicket. In the last million years, multiple human species walked the earth: Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, the Denisovans, the Neanderthals, and perhaps others whose bones we have never found. Many of them overlapped in time and space. And they did not live in isolation. They met, and sometimes they had children together. Some of those encounters are recorded in our genes as what scientists call introgression, the flow of DNA from one species into another. Modern humans outside Africa, for example, carry small percentages of Neanderthal DNA. People in parts of Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan DNA. These genetic fragments influence traits as subtle as immune system responses and as visible as skin and hair adaptations to certain climates. But in the million-year gap, there are signs of something stranger still. Ghost lineages. These are genetic signatures that don't match any known fossil population. They are like footprints on a beach where no one has been seen walking. The simplest explanation is that there were other human groups, now extinct, whose DNA still lingers in us. We don't know their names, their appearance, or the extent of their world, only that they existed, and that they left a trace in the people who survived. One such ghost lineage may have diverged from our ancestors over 1 million years ago, persisted through part of the gap, and then interbred with a population that eventually gave rise to modern humans. The result is that somewhere in your own genetic code may be sequences first carried by a species that has been gone for hundreds of thousands of years. Genetics also reveals the bottlenecks we discussed earlier. When populations shrink drastically, certain genetic variants can vanish entirely, while others can become fixed in the population purely by chance. These events leave signatures, regions of the genome with unusually low diversity. The timing of some of these bottlenecks aligns suspiciously with the environmental catastrophes of the gap, suggesting that survival was not just rare but precarious. Perhaps the most haunting implication of this genetic evidence is how much we have lost. For every fragment of DNA that survived, there may have been countless others, traits, adaptations, possibilities, that disappeared when a lineage died out. In this way, the million-year gap is not just a space of missing artifacts, it is a space of missing potential, of evolutionary paths never taken. And yet, the DNA that remains speaks of resilience. Some genetic variants that likely arose in the gap have been crucial to our survival. Genes linked to temperature regulation, to metabolizing new food sources, to resisting disease, all may have emerged or spread in this era. These were not just the products of chance, they were forged in the crucible of scarcity, migration, and adaptation. It is tempting to anthropomorphize these genetic ghosts, to imagine them as individuals with names, faces, and voices. A woman in a windswept valley, tending a fire against the night. A man following a herd across an open plain, his feet tracing a path that no longer exists. A child, born between two different human groups, carrying the blended heritage of both. We will never know them, but their presence is written in us, carried in the invisible code that builds our bodies and shapes our lives. The study of ancient DNA is still young, and each year brings new surprises. It is possible that in the next decade, advances in recovery techniques will allow us to read genetic material from bones far older than we can now, perhaps even from sediments without bones at all. If that happens, the shadows of the gap may come into sharper focus. But for now, the picture is partial. A mosaic with more missing tiles than filled ones. There is a strange poetry in the fact that our truest connection to the million-year gap is not in the tools we find or the bones we unearth, but in the cells of our own bodies. We are the living artifacts of that time. Every heartbeat is part of an unbroken biological story that somehow, against all odds, continued through the long silence. And so, the DNA tells us two things at once. It tells us that we are the descendants of survivors, that our very existence is proof of unthinkable endurance. But it also tells us that we are not alone in our ancestry. We carry the legacies of vanished peoples, absorbed into our lineage so completely that we could not exist without them. In this way, the million-year gap is not an empty space at all, but a crowded one, filled with the unseen presence of those whose names we'll never know. In the next section, we will leave the inner world of the cell and return to the outer world of stone, where scattered and puzzling artifacts from the gap hint at technological leaps that don't fit neatly into our timelines, tools that shouldn't exist and yet do. Every science has its troublemakers. In archaeology, these troublemakers often take the form of objects, artifacts that seem to stand in the wrong place at the wrong time, refusing to fit neatly into the known timeline. And in the million-year gap, a few such objects raise questions that the rest of the record cannot easily answer. Picture a dig site in a dry riverbed. The layers have been carefully exposed, each one a snapshot of a different age. A stone emerges from the soil, sharp-edged, deliberate, clearly shaped by human hands. At first glance, it is unremarkable. Thousands of such tools have been found. But when the sediment around it is dated, the result sends a ripple of confusion through the research team. It's far older than expected, or far more sophisticated than other tools from the same period. This is the puzzle of the outliers. Most of the artifacts we find from the million-year gap fit a consistent pattern: basic flake tools or Acheulean hand axes with slow, incremental refinements over time. But here and there, we find something that doesn't belong. A finely worked blade where only crude choppers should exist. A tool made from a type of stone found hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting trade or movement far beyond what we thought possible for the era. One example comes from a site in India, where stone tools dated to the middle of the gap appear to show technological diversity more akin to later periods. Another comes from Africa, where unusually symmetrical hand axes have been unearthed in layers much older than the supposed explosion of advanced toolmaking. In each case, archaeologists must grapple with the same question: are these signs of an early leap in human intelligence, or are they anomalies created by erosion, contamination, or dating errors? Skeptics often point to the difficulty of dating artifacts this old. Layers can be disturbed by animals, by water flow, by seismic activity, even by ancient tree roots breaking through sediment. A younger tool can slip down into older layers, or an older one can be reworked and reused in a later period. The Earth is an unreliable archivist. But what if some of these tools truly do belong to their layers? If that's the case, we have to consider that innovation might not have been a single linear path. Instead of a steady climb toward complexity, perhaps it was a jagged, uneven landscape, peaks of creativity that rose and fell, some lost forever, others sparking distant echoes in later times. In small, isolated groups, it's possible that certain individuals developed techniques ahead of their time. A skilled toolmaker might discover a more efficient way to knap stone, producing sharper blades or more durable points. But without a large population to spread this knowledge, the innovation could die with them. In this way, the million-year gap may have held countless firsts: the first finely barbed spear, the first true hafted axe, that appeared briefly and vanished. There's also the possibility of cultural drift. A group might adopt a new toolmaking style not because it's more efficient, but because it's tied to identity, ritual, or prestige. This could explain why some tools from the gap are unusually symmetrical or decorative for no apparent practical reason. Even without art as we know it, humans may have been expressing themselves through the things they made. One particularly intriguing theory is that some of these anomalous tools were made by other human species entirely, species we have little or no fossil record for. If multiple human lineages coexisted during the gap, as genetic evidence suggests, they may have had different technological traditions. When we find a tool that doesn't fit, it might not be an innovation by our direct ancestors at all, but the handiwork of cousins whose world overlapped with ours before fading into extinction. The rarity of these objects makes them all the more tantalizing. Each one is a single data point in a million-year desert. It is not enough to rewrite history, yet it is too strange to ignore. For archaeologists, they are both a source of frustration and a reminder that the past is always more complicated than the neat diagrams in textbooks. And for us, they are sparks in the dark. They suggest that the million-year gap was not entirely a time of stasis, but a landscape of lost experiments. Human hands, of one species or another, were shaping stone with intent and skill, perhaps in ways we have yet to fully understand. If we could line up all the tools made in that age, we might see 1,000 paths branching outward, most of them ending abruptly, some leading to the technologies that would shape the later Stone Age. But because time is a harsh editor, we are left only with fragments: a sharper blade here, a symmetrical axe there, hints of roads not taken. In the next section, we will step back from individual artifacts and look at the world in which they were made, a planet in constant motion, its landscapes shifting under the feet of the people who lived through the gap. The million-year gap was not played out on a static stage. The Earth of that time was restless, a living, shifting canvas that reshaped itself faster than we might think. To survive here was not just to adapt to a single set of conditions, but to navigate a world in perpetual transformation. Imagine the continents as they were then. Africa, still the cradle of humanity, was connected to Eurasia by shifting land bridges in the north, a corridor that opened and closed with the ebb and flow of ice ages. The Mediterranean was smaller, its coast stretching farther out when sea levels dropped. Arabia alternated between being a parched desert and a green, river-fed savanna, depending on the tilt of the Earth's axis and the rhythms of monsoon rains. In the north, glaciers came and went like slow, grinding tides. At their height, they were walls of ice hundreds of meters high, advancing over the land and scraping it bare. They rerouted rivers, carved valleys, and left behind chains of lakes where meltwater pooled. Between glacial periods, the ice retreated, and tundra gave way to forests and grasslands. For humans, each advance and retreat demanded new strategies, new prey, new plants, new shelter. The tropics, too, were in motion. Rainforests expanded and contracted, sometimes breaking apart into isolated pockets separated by open savanna. This created natural green islands where species, including humans, could survive during dry periods, only to reconnect again when wetter climates returned. These cycles may have driven migrations and shaped the genetic diversity, or lack thereof, that we see in modern humans. Coastlines were never fixed. When the glaciers locked up vast amounts of water, sea levels dropped by as much as 120 meters, revealing wide coastal plains. Places that are now deep underwater, the Sunda Shelf between Southeast Asia's islands, the Persian Gulf Basin, the North Sea Plain, were once dry land, rich in game and freshwater. Humans could have lived and thrived there for millennia, leaving tools, shelters, even burial sites, all now buried beneath the waves. Inland, rivers shifted courses, lakes appeared and disappeared, and deserts advanced like armies. The Sahara, which we think of today as a dry expanse, was at times a green paradise, dotted with lakes and flowing rivers, home to hippos, crocodiles, and lush vegetation. At other times, it was a dead zone, a barrier to migration that could trap populations in one region for generations. Volcanism added its own changes to the map. Eruptions reshaped landscapes in a matter of days, covering valleys with lava, damming rivers, creating new lakes in the craters left behind. Some of these new environments were deadly, others may have created fertile ground that attracted game, and, by extension, the hunters who depended on them. The animals that roamed these shifting worlds were as changeable as the landscapes. Herds of giant elephants, rhinoceroses, and antelopes moved with the seasons, their migration stretching across regions that today are divided by oceans or mountain ranges. Predators adapted to these changes, too, lions in forests, saber-toothed cats in open grasslands, packs of wolves on the tundra. For humans, following the herds meant crossing terrains that could transform dramatically between generations. This constant flux was both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, a group could find itself suddenly cut off from resources as a river dried or a forest receded. On the other, a newly opened valley or coastal plain could offer abundant food and fresh water. Those who could move quickly, adapt their hunting techniques, and remember the old routes had the best chance of survival. These environmental shifts also shaped the spread of technology. A group living near abundant stone might develop refined tools, while another in a resource-poor area might rely more on organic materials that left no trace. Climate could dictate whether fire was a daily necessity or a rare luxury, whether shelter was a cave, a lean-to, or simply the open air. Over thousands of years, these local adaptations could create distinct cultural patterns that might never meet unless migration brought different groups into contact. And when contact happened, ideas and techniques could spread rapidly, or vanish just as quickly if one group disappeared in the face of environmental change. The world's instability may also explain why so much of the million-year gap is archaeologically invisible. Many of the best places for human settlement, fertile river valleys, coastal plains, lush lake basins, were precisely the places most vulnerable to flooding, erosion, or submersion. Entire chapters of human activity could be erased in a single geological event. Yet this flux was not purely destructive, it was also a driver of evolution. Populations isolated by climate or geography could develop unique traits, in physiology, behavior, or technology, that made them better suited to their environment. When climates shifted again, bringing groups back into contact, those traits could spread, merge, or compete. In this way, the moving earth itself was a kind of invisible hand, shaping humanity in ways we are only beginning to understand. It is humbling to think that every human alive today is the descendant of people who navigated this shifting planet, who learned to read its moods, to anticipate its changes, to seize opportunities when they arose and endure when they did not. The million-year gap was not a time when the world stood still. It was a time when the ground itself seemed to move under human feet. As we leave this wide, sweeping view of the changing earth, we will narrow our focus once again, this time to the intimate scale of the hunt. In the next section, we will walk alongside our ancestors in the shadow of predators, seeing the gap not from the perspective of survival against the planet, but survival against the teeth and claws that shared it. We think of ourselves today as the planet's dominant hunters, but in the million-year gap, we were far from the top of the food chain. In that world, humans were just another animal, and often not the most dangerous one. To live then was to move through a landscape where almost everything larger than you saw you as either prey or competition. Imagine a small band of early humans moving across an open plain at dawn. The air is cool, the horizon painted in pale gold, the grass wet with dew. They walk quietly, scanning the distance not just for game, but for shapes that move with the wrong rhythm. A lion's slow stalk, the ripple of grass where a hyena pack circles, the still, patient crouch of a saber-toothed cat. Predators of the gap were formidable. Lions were larger and heavier than most living today. Saber-toothed cats, with canines as long as a man's hand, could kill in a single leap. Massive hyenas, bone-crushing specialists, hunted in packs that could strip a carcass in minutes. In the forests and along riverbanks, crocodiles as long as a small bus could take a person in an instant. Even the skies were dangerous. Giant eagles and vultures circled overhead, capable of swooping down on children left unguarded. To survive in such a world required constant awareness. Every hunt for food carried the risk of becoming food. Even the simple act of gathering berries or fetching water demanded vigilance. Human senses, sharp eyesight, acute hearing, were tuned by this constant threat. And our ancestors learned the art of reading the land, the freshness of tracks, the angle of flattened grass, the sudden silence of birds when a predator is near. Hunting strategies reflected this dangerous balance. Humans often targeted smaller, less risky prey, antelope, gazelle, wild pigs, but they also scavenged from the kills of larger predators. This was no casual theft. Approaching a lion's kill meant timing, nerve, and teamwork. Sometimes they would throw stones or shout to drive predators away. Other times, they would wait, patient as shadows, until the killers were gone. Weapons were simple but effective. Wooden spears, hardened in fire, could keep a predator at a distance. Stone-tipped spears, rare in the earlier parts of the gap but more common later, gave a group a chance to wound from farther away. But even with weapons, most encounters were decided not by force but by caution. The smartest hunters were those who knew when not to fight. Predators were not just threats, they were also teachers. By watching them, humans learned patterns, where the herds would gather, where waterholes would be safest, how to move without being seen. The stalking techniques of cats, the patience of crocodiles, the coordination of hunting dogs, all had lessons to offer. Still, danger could come suddenly. A child wandering too far from camp, a hunter distracted by the chase, a night when the fire burned too low and its light no longer kept the beasts at bay. In such moments, survival depended on speed and unity. The group's ability to respond together, to shout, to throw, to rush in defense, could mean the difference between loss and escape. It's possible that this shared danger helped shape the deep roots of human cooperation. In a world where predators could take you at any moment, your safety depended on others as much as on yourself. The watchful eyes of your kin were your shield. In return, you watched for them. This mutual vigilance wove an invisible net around the group, a net of trust, obligation, and memory. Not all predators were enemies. Wolves and wild dogs sometimes followed human hunters, feeding on scraps and discarded bones. Over time, these relationships could have grown into cautious tolerance. While true domestication was still far in the future, the beginnings of interspecies alliances may have been seeded here, alliances born from shared hunts and shared dangers. And humans were not always the hunted. In certain conditions, they could become formidable hunters of even the largest prey. Working together, a group could surround a giant herbivore, drive it into a trap, or exhaust it through persistence hunting, chasing it over long distances until it collapsed from heat and fatigue. These hunts were rare and risky, but when they succeeded, they provided a feast that could sustain the group for days. The line between hunter and hunted was never fixed. One day's prey could be tomorrow's predator, depending on luck, terrain, and the balance of numbers. This fluidity kept humans humble and cautious. The million-year gap was not an age of dominance, it was an age of survival. And survival meant respecting the power of the other creatures who shared the land. Predators also entered human stories. We cannot know the exact words or gestures our ancestors used, but we can imagine tales told around the fire, warnings, lessons, boasts of narrow escapes. The memory of the great cats, the crocodiles, the snakes may have been passed down for generations, shaping a worldview where humans were not the center of creation but one thread in a dangerous, interwoven web of life. As we step out of this shadowed world of teeth and claws, our view will widen again, to follow the movements of humans themselves as they crossed continents in migrations we can only partially trace. In the next section, we will explore the forgotten migrations, journeys across vanished rivers, drowned coastlines, and hidden land bridges whose traces now lie buried beneath time. If we could watch the million-year gap from far above, not for a day or a year, but for hundreds of millennia, we would see the earth in motion, and with it the quiet, persistent flow of human movement. Thin streams of figures crossing open plains, skirting the edges of forests, threading between mountains, and sometimes vanishing into the unknown. We think of migration today as a single dramatic event, a wave of people moving from one place to another. But in the deep past, it was less like a wave and more like the slow seep of water through stone. Generations would move gradually, almost imperceptibly, over decades and centuries. A hunting ground became less productive, a river changed course, a new valley opened. Step by step, season by season, the edges of the known world stretched outward. These forgotten migrations began in Africa, as they always had. The continent was not just the starting point, but the constant anchor of humanity's story. Shifting climates alternately opened and closed pathways to Eurasia. When rains returned, the Sahara could transform from a deadly barrier into a lush, green corridor, dotted with lakes, rivers, and game-rich grasslands. In those times, humans could move north, following herds and water, until they reached the narrow land bridge into the Middle East. From there, the possibilities multiplied. To the east lay vast plains and river systems stretching into India and Southeast Asia. At certain points in the gap, sea levels fell so low that the islands of Indonesia were linked to the mainland by dry land, creating a vast extension of Asia known as the Sunda Shelf. Early humans may have walked across these exposed lands, reaching areas that are now deep beneath the ocean. To the west, the Mediterranean basin could alternately be a barrier of open water or a patchwork of connected land and short sea crossings, depending on sea levels and tectonic changes. In some glacial periods, coastlines stretched far beyond their modern boundaries, creating broad, fertile plains where humans could hunt and fish before they were swallowed by the returning seas. Some routes were easier than others. Following rivers was a natural choice. They provided fresh water, food, and predictable pathways through the land. Ancient river systems, some now dry or buried, would have been vital lifelines for migrating groups. Lakes, too, served as magnets for human settlement, offering fish, waterfowl, and game drawn to drink at their shores. But these migrations were not aimless wanderings. They were driven by necessity, the slow push and pull of survival. A prolonged drought might force a group to leave a familiar home in search of better resources. A volcanic eruption could poison the land with ash, sending survivors outward like ripples from a stone dropped in water. Changes in prey migration patterns might draw humans into entirely new regions. There is evidence, scattered and faint, that some of these journeys were longer and more daring than we once imagined. Stone tools have been found on islands that would have required at least short sea crossings to reach, suggesting that early humans had already learned to navigate open water in simple craft or by using floating debris. These ventures would have been risky, especially in unpredictable weather, but the rewards could be great. Islands often offered rich, untapped resources and fewer predators. Many of these migrations likely ended in failure. A group might reach a new land only to find it barren or dangerous, forcing them to retreat or perish. Others might survive for generations, only to vanish later without leaving a trace. In some cases, migration may have brought humans into contact with other hominin species, encounters that could lead to competition, conflict, or the exchange of genes and technologies. The traces of these movements are frustratingly elusive. Footprints in ancient mud, now fossilized in stone, offer fleeting glimpses, a small group walking together, perhaps adults and children, their steps frozen in time for hundreds of thousands of years. Stone tools, often the only surviving artifacts, can tell us where people lived but not exactly where they came from or where they went. Even genetic evidence is partial, hinting at ancient mixing without revealing the full map of the journeys. And yet, the pattern emerges. Humans in the million-year gap were not static. They were explorers, even if they never saw themselves that way. They pushed into new lands because survival demanded it. They adapted to new climates, new prey, new threats. Each migration was a gamble, but the gamble was life itself. One of the most intriguing aspects of these forgotten migrations is how they may have shaped human psychology. To live in a constantly changing landscape, to know that survival might depend on moving beyond the next hill or river, is to be shaped by mobility. Curiosity, adaptability, and a tolerance for uncertainty may have been as important as skill with tools or fire. It is also possible that migration itself fostered innovation. Moving into a new environment forced humans to experiment with unfamiliar resources. A plant unknown in one region might become a staple in another. A different kind of stone might inspire new tool shapes. New hunting grounds might demand new strategies. Each journey carried the potential for discovery. Of course, migration was not a constant march forward. Groups could settle for centuries in a particularly favorable area, building deep knowledge of the land. But over the span of the gap, the long-term trend was outward, slowly, irregularly, across continents and into the unknown. We cannot name the people who made these journeys. We do not know their leaders, their routes, or their destinies. But we can imagine the moments they shared, a band cresting a ridge to see a valley spread out before them, the first cautious steps onto an unfamiliar shore, the relief of finding water after days of searching. These were the milestones of their lives, even if they never thought of them as history. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of the million-year gap is that so many of these migrations ended in erasure. The plains they crossed are now ocean floors. The camps they built have been ground to dust by glaciers. The trails they followed have been swallowed by forests or deserts. All that remains are a few scattered stones and the faint echoes of their genes. In the next section, we will leave the vast landscapes and follow our ancestors into the heart of their camps, to sit beside their fires and imagine the slow flowering of culture during the gap, in a world where each ember of human ingenuity had to be protected against the night. Night in the deep past was absolute. Without fire, darkness was not just the absence of light, it was a physical presence, a living thing that pressed close, filled with the sounds of unseen life. The wind carried the distant roar of predators, the rustle of leaves under cautious feet, the splash of something moving in the river. In such a world, fire was more than warmth or light. It was a fragile fortress. Imagine a small group of humans gathered in the glow of such a fire. The flames crackle, sending up spirals of sparks that drift and vanish into the night sky. Beyond the circle of light, the world is unknowable, a wall of black, pierced only by the occasional glint of eyes. Inside the circle, faces flicker in gold and shadow, their expressions soft, reflective. Some of these fires were tended by Homo erectus, who may have been the first to master its use, though mastery in this era was fragile. Fire was a skill, not yet a certainty. In many places, it still had to be captured from the wild, taken from a lightning-struck tree, from the embers left after a grass fire, from the belly of a volcano, and kept alive, because losing it meant risking nights without protection. To keep a fire alive was an art in itself. The right wood had to be gathered and stored. The embers needed careful tending through the night, stirred and fed before they dimmed too far. In some groups, one or more people may have been entrusted as keepers of the flame, a role as vital as any hunter or gatherer. It's easy to imagine a tradition forming where the fire was never allowed to die completely, where its survival was bound up with the survival of the people themselves. Firelight changed what night meant. It stretched the day into the hours when the sun was gone, allowing more time for toolmaking, food preparation, and perhaps something more profound, conversation. We cannot know the exact form of their language. It may have been gestures, vocal calls, proto-words, but firelight created space for exchange. Shadows on cave walls might have been used to illustrate stories or hunting strategies. Rhythmic sounds, humming or chanting, could have emerged in the quiet safety of the camp. In this way, fire may have been the birthplace of culture. Around it, ideas could be shared, skills passed down, and memories preserved in a form that could outlast a single generation. A child could watch their elders shape stone, roast meat, or prepare fibers, learning not just through doing, but through observing in the steady light. The sensory world of these camps would have been rich and layered, the smell of roasting meat mingling with the resin scent of burning wood, the warmth of the flames against the cool night air, the way light turned a stone tool in the hand into something that gleamed, almost alive. These moments, repeated night after night, year after year, would have left deep impressions on the human mind. It's possible that ritual began here, in the interplay of fire and dark. Certain foods might have been shared only at night, certain stories told only in the flicker of flame. Perhaps people offered scraps of food to the fire itself, treating it as a living ally. Archaeologists have found hints of this reverence in much later periods, but the seeds could have been planted here, deep in the gap. Firelight also gave humans a new kind of control over their environment. Meat could be cooked, making it easier to chew and digest. Dangerous insects and parasites could be driven away. Hard plants could be softened. These advantages weren't just practical. They had long-term effects on human evolution, freeing more energy for brain development and broadening the diet in ways that may have supported population recovery after environmental disasters. But perhaps the most transformative power of fire was psychological. To sit by a fire in the dark is to have a center, a fixed point around which the mind can rest. In a life of constant movement and danger, the campfire was a rare place of stillness. It may have been the first true home, even if home lasted only a few nights before the group moved on. These moments of safety would not have been taken for granted. At any time, danger could pierce the circle of light, a predator emboldened by hunger, a sudden storm, a branch falling from above. The fire was a shield, but not an invincible one. Its light made the darkness beyond seem deeper, its warmth making the cold air at the edges sharper. This contrast would have heightened the sense of belonging and protection within the group. It's not hard to imagine how these fires became woven into identity. Our fire may have been more than a physical flame, it could have meant the group itself, the bond that kept them alive. The passing of embers from one camp to another might have been an act of kinship or alliance. Losing the fire might have been as devastating as losing a member of the group. In the million-year gap, there were no permanent monuments, no carved stones, no written records. But there were these circles of light scattered across the continents, each one a small point of human presence against the vast dark. And though the embers of those ancient fires are long cold, their legacy burns in every hearth, every candle, every flicker of flame we kindle today. From the glow of these camps, we now step into murkier territory, not the tangible warmth of fire, but the elusive heat of speculation. In the next section, we will explore one of the most provocative ideas about the million-year gap, that perhaps it hides the traces of early, forgotten civilizations, societies advanced for their time, erased so completely that only whispers of them remain. For most archaeologists, the million-year gap is explained by scarcity, of people, of artifacts, of survivable conditions. But there's another, more provocative idea, one that slips in from the edges of science into the territory of speculation. What if the gap hides the traces of early civilizations? Not civilizations in the modern sense, no skyscrapers, no steel, but societies advanced for their time, capable of building, shaping, and organizing in ways we did not expect for that age. The problem with deep time is that it erases almost everything. A wooden hut can rot away in decades. Woven cloth disappears in months. Even stone structures, without maintenance, crumble to dust in a few thousand years. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of years, and you begin to see the scale of the challenge. If a small, organized human society existed during the gap, it could vanish so completely that the earth would swallow every trace. Some researchers point to anomalies, a handful of sites where artifacts seem unusually sophisticated for their age, or where environmental conditions suggest the possibility of large, sustained communities. For example, certain river valleys in Africa and Asia show repeated signs of occupation over long periods, with tools that suggest a degree of planning and specialization beyond what small, nomadic groups might produce. Are these hints of something more organized, or simply the work of particularly resourceful bands? The phantom civilization theory gains energy from what we know about later history. Time and again, we've found that ancient humans were more capable than we assumed. Neanderthals, once thought brutish and primitive, are now known to have buried their dead and possibly made art. Indigenous cultures across the globe engineered landscapes, managed resources, and built enduring monuments long before outsiders gave them credit. Could something similar have happened even earlier, only to be erased by time? Critics argue that this is unlikely. Civilization in the archaeological sense requires sustained agriculture, permanent settlement, and complex social structures, none of which we have evidence for in the million-year gap. The mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle was, by all indications, the dominant survival strategy, and it leaves few permanent marks on the land. Without large-scale building or farming, the material traces of such a society would be too fragile to survive for so long. And yet, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In certain parts of the world, the most promising archaeological layers are buried under hundreds of meters of sediment, drowned beneath seas, or hidden in dense forests where excavation is nearly impossible. Coastal plains that might once have been home to thriving populations are now far offshore. Even in accessible areas, only a fraction of potential sites have been investigated, and most of those only partially. There's also the matter of scale. A civilization during the gap would not need to be global, or even continental. It could have been a cluster of interconnected communities along a fertile river, or a chain of settlements along a migratory route, maintaining contact and exchanging goods. If such a network lasted only a few thousand years, it might still leave so little behind that modern science could miss it entirely. The human mind is drawn to such possibilities not just because they are exciting, but because they challenge our sense of linear progress. We like to imagine that culture, technology, and society evolve in a steady climb from simple to complex. But history, and prehistory, often moves in fits and starts. Advances can be made and lost, rediscovered centuries later by people who believe they are inventing them for the first time. If a phantom civilization did exist in the gap, its disappearance would be almost inevitable. A climate shift could destroy its food base. A volcanic eruption could bury its heartland in ash. Rising seas could erase its settlements. Small populations are inherently vulnerable. One or two disasters could wipe them out entirely. And if their survivors reverted to a more nomadic life, the skills and knowledge of their society could vanish within a few generations. Some modern myths and oral traditions, passed down for tens of thousands of years, speak of lost golden ages, great floods, or cities swallowed by the earth. Most of these stories come from much later periods, but the idea that cultural memory can survive extreme stretches of time is not far-fetched. Could fragments of such tales be distant echoes of events from the gap? We can't say, but the thought lingers. Ultimately, the phantom civilization hypothesis is less about proving a specific theory than about widening our perspective. It reminds us that the past is bigger than our current evidence. We have uncovered only scattered islands of knowledge in an ocean of time. What lies beneath the waves remains, for now, invisible. As we leave this speculative territory, we return to firmer ground, not in the soil beneath our feet, but in the very code of life. In the next section, we'll examine the great genetic gamble, how natural selection, environmental pressure, and chance shaped the humans who would one day step out of the gap. Every life is a wager. In the million-year gap, every birth was a roll of the dice, a gamble that the newborn would survive long enough to pass on their blood, that their traits would be an advantage rather than a liability, that the world they grew into would still have space for them. Natural selection is often described as purposeful, as if it's a careful craftsman shaping life toward a perfect form. But in truth, it's a ruthless casino where the rules change constantly. The environment sets the odds, and the winnings are measured in survival. In the gap, those odds were brutal. Each generation faced an unstable world, shifting climates, disappearing prey, new predators, unpredictable landscapes. The traits that kept you alive one decade could doom you in the next. A body built for speed on the open plain might become a burden if forests closed in. Skill at fishing would be useless in a drought. A thick coat of hair could save you in a cold snap, then kill you in the next heat wave. Genetics is the silent currency of this gamble. Mutations, tiny changes in DNA, happened constantly. Most were neutral, some harmful, and a rare few helpful. In small populations like those of the gap, a single mutation could spread quickly if it offered even a slight edge. But the opposite was also true. A disadvantage could linger for generations simply because there were too few people for natural selection to weed it out quickly. This is where chance, genetic drift, plays its quiet, invisible role. Sometimes survival had little to do with fitness and everything to do with luck. An advantageous mutation might vanish forever if its carriers died in a flood or were killed by predators. A neutral trait might dominate a population simply because the individuals who had it happened to survive long enough to reproduce. In this way, evolution during the gap was not a straight march forward but a chaotic shuffle. Different human groups experimented with different solutions to survival: taller, shorter, more robust, more gracile. Brain sizes fluctuated, as did body proportions, depending on the demands of each environment. The humans who emerged at the far side of the gap were the products of countless experiments, most of which ended in failure. And then there were the interbreeding events, the moments when different human species crossed paths and produced children. These encounters were themselves genetic gambles. Sometimes the mixing produced individuals less fit for the environment. Other times it created hybrids with a combination of traits that offered a crucial advantage: immunity to a disease, resistance to cold, or an ability to metabolize new foods. We see the echoes of these gambles in our DNA today. Variants that help modern humans cope with high altitudes or resist certain pathogens may have originated in other human species we met during this period. The million-year gap was not just a time of survival. It was a time of genetic blending, the weaving of multiple evolutionary threads into the tapestry that would become us. The stakes of this gamble were total. Lose, and your lineage vanished forever. Win, and your traits might ripple forward through thousands of generations. This was true not only for individuals but for ideas. A hunting technique, a method of making fire, a way to store food, these two had to survive the gauntlet of time. If the people who knew them died, the knowledge died too. From the perspective of deep time, the gap can be seen as a vast evolutionary bottleneck. Populations shrank and grew again, sometimes repeatedly, forcing genetic diversity through narrow channels. This could be dangerous, reducing resilience to disease and environmental change, but it could also speed the spread of beneficial traits. The humans who emerged on the other side were not random survivors, they were shaped by this crucible. It's easy to think of evolution as inevitable, as if we were always destined to arrive here, watching this story from the safety of the present. But the truth is more fragile. Many evolutionary experiments fail. Entire species with potential vanish. If the dice had fallen differently, if one volcanic eruption had been slightly larger, if one glacial advance had lasted a little longer, the human story could have ended in the gap, leaving the Earth to other creatures. And yet, we didn't vanish. We adapted, sometimes in ways so subtle they leave no fossil trace. Our muscles, our bones, our brains shifted in response to the demands of survival. We became better walkers, better toolmakers, better communicators. Each of these shifts was paid for in risk, in lives spent testing the boundaries of what was possible. This is the part of the story that is both humbling and haunting. We are here because of chance as much as design. We carry in ourselves the record of improbable wins, lucky births, narrow escapes, migrations taken at the right moment. We are the descendants of risk-takers who bet their lives against the chaos of the gap and won. The million-year gap was not simply an empty space in history. It was an arena, and every human alive was a player in a game they didn't know they were playing. They had no choice but to wager everything, every day, for generations beyond counting. In the next section, we'll turn from the realm of genes to the shifting seas, to explore where the water rose and how the oceans themselves erased vast chapters of our history, hiding the homes and journeys of our ancestors beneath the waves. If the million-year gap is a book with missing pages, many of those pages are not lost to fire or decay, they are buried beneath the sea. The coastlines of today are not the coastlines of the past. Over the long arc of the gap, ice ages came and went, and with each cycle the oceans fell and rose by more than 100 meters. In those rises and falls, entire human landscapes were created and then erased. When glaciers locked away vast amounts of water, sea levels dropped, revealing coastal plains so broad they seemed like entire new continents. River mouths extended far beyond their modern positions, carving fertile valleys where fish swam thick and game grazed freely. Shorelines became highways, easy routes for human migration where food was abundant and the climate more forgiving than inland extremes. It is here, on those vanished coasts, that much of our missing story may have unfolded. Humans have always been drawn to the edges of land and water. Fresh fish, shellfish, seabirds, and marine mammals offered reliable food. Driftwood and seaweed could be used for fuel, shelter, and tools. Rivers meeting the sea created rich estuaries, nurseries for life. For small mobile groups, the coast was both a pantry and a road. But the coast is also a liar. It offers comfort, then takes it away. When the ice melted and the seas began to rise, those sprawling plains disappeared beneath the waves. Camps, middens, hearths, and even entire seasonal settlements were swallowed. Within a few human generations, the familiar world would be gone, replaced by an endless expanse of water where land once stretched. Archaeologists suspect that some of the most important sites for understanding the gap now lie far offshore. The Sunda Shelf between Southeast Asia's islands, the Persian Gulf Basin, and the North Sea Plain, all were dry land at various points, and all would have been prime human habitat. Today, they are hundreds of feet below the surface, their secrets locked under layers of silt and sand. Underwater archaeology has begun to glimpse this hidden world. Off the coast of Australia, stone tools have been found submerged at depths that could only have been dry land tens of thousands of years ago. In the North Sea, dredging has brought up fossilized bones of animals, and occasionally humans, from a landscape that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. These finds are from periods later than much of the gap, but they are proof of principle. The ocean floor can hold traces of human life far older than we might expect. The challenge is that the deeper we go in time, the harder those traces are to find. Wave action, currents, and sedimentation can scatter and bury artifacts beyond recognition. Wooden structures, woven materials, and even many types of stone tools are ground down or buried too deep to recover. In some places, tectonic activity has shifted the seafloor itself, breaking apart or burying any evidence that might have survived. Yet the idea of what might be down there is compelling. Picture a wide grassy plain stretching out where the waves now roll, dotted with small encampments. Fires burn at the edges of tidal creeks. Hunters return with fish strung on vines. Children play along a shore that is now 200 meters beneath the sea. Those people would have known the ocean not as a distant horizon but as a neighbor, and perhaps as a threat if they saw the tides creeping higher over their lifetimes. The rising water may have shaped human behavior in ways we can only guess. Groups forced inland would have had to adapt to new foods, new terrains, and perhaps more competition with others. Migrations may have been triggered not by sudden disaster but by the slow drowning of home. Entire cultural identities could have been tied to coastlines now lost, languages, stories, and skills that made sense only in a world that no longer exists. There's also a haunting possibility that the ocean swallowed not just camps but knowledge. If certain fishing techniques, boat-making skills, or coastal hunting strategies were never needed inland, they may have died with the people who practiced them. The million-year gap may hide not just physical evidence but entire categories of human innovation erased by geography. This perspective changes how we think about the gap. It is not simply a failure of preservation in the places we can reach. It is a reminder that we are looking at only a fraction of the ancient human world, the parts that happen to be above the high water mark when the present sea levels settled. Everything else, perhaps most of it, lies beneath the waves. And so, the ocean is both a participant in and a witness to our story. It shaped the routes our ancestors took, fed them, protected them from predators, and then, with the same indifferent power, erased their traces. What lies below may hold answers to the questions that have haunted the gap since we first began to notice it. In the next section, we will shift from the sea's quiet erasure to the raw forces that sculpted both land and mind, ashes, ice, and time, a slow atmospheric interlude that will let us feel how the gap's climatic shifts carve not just the planet but the human experience itself. There are chapters in history that are written in words, others in stone. The million-year gap is written in weather, in the slow pulse of ice and fire, in the whisper of wind across empty plains, in the weight of seasons that do not end. First, the ash. It begins as a shadow on the horizon, too distant to fear. Then the horizon itself rises, a column of black and red climbing into the sky. The air changes, a sharp, mineral bite in the lungs. Days later, the sun is gone, hidden behind a gauze of dust. Even at noon, the world is dim. Nights are colder now. The plants wilt. The animals thin. And for years, the sky remains strange, the seasons out of rhythm. The humans alive in such times may not have had words for eruption or climate shift, but they felt its weight in every meal that came later, and every hunger that lasted longer. Then, the ice. It does not arrive with a roar but with a whisper, a gradual thickening of snow in places where snow should melt. Glaciers do not charge forward, they creep, day by day, year by year, until valleys are filled and rivers are trapped beneath frozen walls. The air is sharper, thinner. The wind carries a constant hiss of blowing snow. Forests shrink, grasslands brown and wither. The world becomes smaller, travel harder, hunting riskier. And when the ice retreats, it leaves behind a new land, rivers in new courses, lakes where none had been, open plains where once there were forests. The humans who return to these places do not return to the same world they left. And always, the time. Not the neat ticking of clocks, but the weight of centuries. Generations live and die under the same sky, in the same stretch of valley or coast, never knowing that the ground beneath them is shifting in ways only their great-grandchildren will see. The earth moves at its own pace, too slow for the eyes, too fast for the bones. For the people of the gap, time was not an abstract concept. It was felt in the migration of herds, the growth of trees, the length of a drought. It was the memory of a river that once ran full but now runs shallow, the recollection of a hunting ground that is gone. It was passed in stories and habits, in the routes taken each season, in the knowledge of when to move and when to stay. Ash, ice, and time, these were not background conditions. They were sculptors shaping the human experience. Ash thinned the herds and forced diets to change. Ice cut off routes, created new refuges, and erased others. Time wore away at memory, blurring the boundaries between what was known and what was guessed. And yet, these forces were also teachers. Ash taught resilience, the ability to endure seasons of scarcity. Ice taught patience, the recognition that change, once begun, could last longer than a lifetime. Time taught humility, the awareness that the world does not bend to human will. In the million-year gap, life was lived against this vast backdrop. People moved like shadows over the land, leaving traces so faint that only the most patient search can find them now. And perhaps that is the quiet truth of this era, that survival, not dominance, was the human way. That to endure was to adapt, not to conquer. This interlude is not the climax of the story. It is a pause, the deep breath before the world changes again. Ahead lies the re-emergence of innovation, of culture, of a human presence in the record so sudden it feels like a return from the dead. In the next section, we will step out of the long quiet and meet the pioneers after the silence, the humans who emerged from the far side of the gap, carrying with them the lessons of ash, ice, and time. The silence does not end with a shout. It begins to lift the way the first light creeps over the horizon, slowly, tentatively, until, suddenly, you realize the world has changed. After hundreds of thousands of years in which the archaeological record is faint and scattered, something shifts. Around 300,000 years ago, the stones begin to speak again. And this time, their language is different. The tools are sharper, more varied. Hand axes give way to finely flaked points, blades, and scrapers, each one shaped with deliberate precision for a specific purpose. Pigments appear in the record: ochre, hematite, perhaps used for decoration, perhaps for ritual, perhaps for reasons we cannot guess. Some sites show signs of organized living spaces, with areas for toolmaking, cooking, and sleeping, the first hints of planning not just for the day, but for the season. The humans who emerge from the far side of the gap are recognizably closer to us. In Africa, Homo sapiens is stirring. In Europe and Western Asia, the Neanderthals are refining their own sophisticated ways of life. Farther east, the Denisovans leave only the faintest genetic traces, but their existence will one day be confirmed in a fragment of bone from a Siberian cave. What unites these groups is not a single tool or behavior, but a new tempo of innovation. Change, which once moved glacially, now seems to speed up. A hunting method that might have taken tens of thousands of years to spread in earlier times now appears across regions in far less time. Knowledge flows more easily, suggesting denser networks of contact, or at least more frequent encounters between groups. This is not a sudden revolution, but it is a turning point. The people of this era are the heirs of the gap's lessons: adaptability, resilience, cooperation. Their tools are the direct descendants of those carried through ice, ash, and scarcity, but honed by generations of trial and error. Their bodies bear the genetic signatures of survivors, shaped by countless gambles won and lost. We cannot know their thoughts, but we can read their actions. In some sites, we find evidence of hunting large game in coordinated groups, driving animals into traps or over cliffs, a strategy that requires planning, communication, and trust. In others, we see signs of food processing, grinding stones, heated rocks for cooking. These are not just acts of survival, they are steps toward mastery over the environment. And there are hints, just hints, of something more. The ochre could have been used to mark skin, tools, or shelter. Arrangements of stones and bones may have been purely practical, or they may have held symbolic meaning. We tread carefully here. The desire to see ourselves in the past is strong, but the possibility that symbolic thought was taking root cannot be ignored. Physically, these humans are varied. Homo sapiens in Africa are beginning to show the fully modern anatomy we recognize today: high foreheads, lighter brow ridges, more delicate jaws. Neanderthals are robust and powerful, adapted to cold climates with broad noses and stocky frames. The Denisovans, known almost entirely from DNA, remain a mystery in form, but their genes will flow into future populations, leaving subtle traces in people thousands of miles from their homeland. What is striking is not the differences, but the parallels. Across continents, humans are solving problems in similar ways, refining tools, expanding diets, exploring new territories. This suggests that the survival strategies forged in the gap were not isolated accidents, but universal responses to the challenges of a changing world. One can imagine what it might have felt like to be alive then. The land is still dangerous, the climate still unpredictable, but there is a new confidence in the air. Fires burn brighter and more consistently. Hunts end more often in success. Camps grow slightly larger, their inhabitants staying together longer before splitting apart. The world is still harsh, but it is becoming a place humans can shape rather than simply endure. It is tempting to see this as the beginning of a march toward the present, but that would be a mistake. Extinction still waits in the wings, for species, for groups, for lineages. The gap's long shadow has not vanished, it is simply receding. The lessons learned in its darkness remain vital, because the dangers it taught humans to survive still exist. But there is also something undeniably new in this moment. It is as if humanity has stepped out of a long night into a dim but growing dawn. We can see them, in the stones they shaped, in the pigments they ground, in the places they chose to live, and, in seeing them, we can see the thread that connects us. The pioneers after the silence are not our ancestors alone. They are our cousins, our rivals, our collaborators in the great experiment of survival. They are proof that the million-year gap was not a void, but a crucible, one that forged humans capable of more than endurance. Capable of imagination. In the next section, we will follow that imagination into the realm of memory and myth. We will ask whether the stories of floods, darkness, and fire, handed down through millennia, might be faint, distorted echoes of the gap itself. Long before writing, long before carved symbols or painted walls, there were stories. They did not live on paper or stone. They lived in the breath and memory of those who told them, passed from parent to child, elder to hunter, wanderer to camp. Around the fire, beneath the stars, in whispers at the edge of sleep, this was the first library. We often think of myth as invention, but myth can also be memory, worn and reshaped by the centuries. In the million-year gap, when nothing was written, stories were the only way to remember anything beyond a single lifetime. And if an event was strange enough, terrible enough, or wondrous enough, it might be told again and again until it became a truth no one had personally seen but everyone knew. Some anthropologists believe that certain myths recorded in the last few thousand years may preserve fragments of much older experiences. Myths of a world-destroying flood, found on every inhabited continent, could echo not just local disasters but memories of rising seas at the end of an ice age, events that, to their witnesses, must have felt like the drowning of the world. Could earlier floods, long before the last glacial melt, have inspired similar tales in the gap? The coastlines of that time rose and fell dramatically, and to people whose homes were tied to the sea, such change could become a defining cultural memory. Other myths speak of endless darkness, of suns that vanished and skies that turned cold. Volcanic winters, caused by massive eruptions, can create such conditions, and we know these occurred during the gap. To live through a year without summer, to watch crops fail, herds weaken, and frost cling to the ground even in the warm season, would have been a trauma worth remembering. Passed through countless retellings, it might become the tale of a battle between sky gods or the punishment of a great fire spirit. Fire itself occupies a strange dual role in ancient stories, both savior and destroyer. Myths of fire stolen from the gods or fire erupting from the earth may trace their roots to the gap's volcanic landscapes and to the fragile mastery of flame by our ancestors. In an age when fire could mean survival or death depending on the wind, it would be natural to weave it into the central threads of human identity. There are also myths of giants, beings larger and stronger than ordinary humans, who roamed the land in ages past. To us, these sound like fantasy, but to someone in the gap, meeting another human species, taller, stockier, or simply different, could have inspired stories that endured long after the other group vanished. Even the bones of extinct megafauna, discovered by later humans without the context of paleontology, might have been interpreted as the remains of such giants. Of course, memory is not static. A story changes with each telling, shaped by the teller's purpose, the listener's reaction, and the needs of the moment. A tale meant to warn might grow darker, one meant to inspire might become grander. Over thousands of years, details blur and merge. A flood merges with a volcanic winter. A predator becomes a supernatural monster. A migration becomes an exile or a quest. Yet beneath the embellishment, the seed of truth may remain. There is an intriguing parallel in the way some indigenous Australian oral traditions describe landscapes that were drowned by rising seas at the end of the last ice age, events at least 7,000 years old. Geological evidence has confirmed that these places were indeed once dry land. If such memories can survive for millennia, carried entirely by spoken word, how far back could the chain extend? Could fragments of the gap survive in the oldest myths we know? We cannot prove it. The chain of memory has too many missing links. But thinking of myth as a kind of cultural fossil opens a new way to imagine the gap. Instead of seeing it only as a blank in the record, we can picture it as a time rich in experiences that, while invisible to archaeology, may still live in the deep structures of human storytelling. Perhaps, somewhere in the rhythm of a ceremonial dance, is an echo of a migration route taken 500,000 years ago. Perhaps, in a lullaby's imagery, is the shadow of a predator that once hunted our kind. Perhaps the cautionary tale about crossing the river after dark recalls a real place, a real danger, in a world that no longer exists. In this sense, myth is not just a memory of the gap, it is a bridge across it. It allows us to step into the minds of people who left no writing, no art, no enduring architecture, but who still had the same need we do, to explain their world, to understand their place in it, and to pass on what mattered. The challenge is that without physical evidence, myth cannot be dated with certainty. For science, it remains suggestive rather than conclusive. But for a storyteller, a philosopher, or anyone who feels the pull of deep time, myth offers something the stones cannot, an emotional connection. It tells us not just what might have happened, but what it might have felt like. As we leave the realm of story, we return to the discipline of archaeology, but we carry with us the awareness that absence in the material record does not mean absence in human experience. The million-year gap may live on not in the earth beneath our feet, but in the words we still speak and the dreams we still dream. In the next section, we will examine the archaeology of absence, the science of studying what isn't there, and how researchers navigate the strange paradox of reconstructing a history defined by what it has lost. Most of archaeology is about what you find. The million-year gap forces archaeology to be about what you don't. The paradox is simple. We know humans existed during this time, yet the material record is so thin it feels like trying to read a book with most of the pages missing, and some of the surviving pages erased. In this way, the absence itself becomes a kind of artifact, something to be studied and understood. For scientists, the first step in reading absence is to define its edges. We know what came before the gap, Homo erectus, their Acheulean hand axes, their long-range migrations. We know what came after, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the burst of cultural and technological complexity we can still see today. Between these two boundaries lies the void, and by comparing what's on either side, we can begin to guess at what's missing. But the guesswork is methodical. Archaeologists use a mix of indirect evidence and environmental context to fill in the blanks. Sediment layers can reveal climate patterns, suggesting why certain areas might have been abandoned or uninhabitable. Fossilized pollen can reconstruct ancient vegetation, telling us what food sources were available. Animal bones, even without human tools beside them, can show patterns of hunting or scavenging if they bear cut marks or deliberate breakage. The problem is that absence can be misleading. A site with no tools might mean humans were never there. Or it might mean humans were there but left no durable artifacts. Or it might mean they left artifacts that were destroyed, buried too deep to find, or carried away by water or wind. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither is it proof of presence. This is the frustrating tightrope scientists must walk. Sometimes the only clue is statistical improbability. If a region with known human occupation suddenly shows centuries or millennia of silence in the record, something happened. The land could have become inhospitable. Populations could have moved. Or the humans who lived there could have adopted ways of life that left little behind, lighter tools, more organic materials, fewer permanent structures. Each possibility has to be weighed without the comfort of a smoking gun. There's also the challenge of ghost sites, places we suspect were important but which have been erased entirely by erosion, flooding, or tectonic shifts. Many of these are along ancient coastlines now far underwater. Others may be buried under thick layers of younger sediment, hidden until erosion, construction, or chance reveals them. In this sense, much of the gap is literally out of reach. And yet, absence has its own data. The scattered artifacts we do find, a blade here, a flake there, are mapped meticulously, their locations plotted against ancient climate reconstructions, known migration corridors, and resource distributions. Even a handful of finds can suggest a pattern, hinting at seasonal movement, trade, or cultural boundaries. In the million-year gap, a single tool can be as valuable as an entire village site in later periods. Sometimes the most telling evidence is negative. If a tool type common in one era disappears in the next, it might mean the group that made it vanished or moved away. If a type of stone once traded widely stops appearing far from its source, it could mean that trade routes collapsed. These absences point to disruptions, environmental, social, or both. The archaeology of absence also requires humility. Researchers must resist the urge to fill the gap with assumptions that fit too neatly. It is tempting to see every rare artifact as proof of a lost civilization or every empty stretch as proof of catastrophe. But sometimes the simplest explanation, that humans lived in small, scattered groups and left little behind, is the truest. Still, working with absence forces creativity. Archaeologists collaborate with geneticists to trace population movements through DNA, with climatologists to model ancient environments, with geologists to understand how the land has shifted. This interdisciplinary approach turns the gap into a shared puzzle, where each field adds a fragment of the missing picture. There's also a philosophical dimension to the archaeology of absence. It reminds us that history is not the same as the past. The past is everything that happened. History is only what we've managed to record. The million-year gap is a vast reminder of how much lies outside the reach of our knowledge, and how easily our own era could one day vanish from memory if the wrong conditions align. For the public, the gap can be frustrating. People want narratives, not question marks. They want clear beginnings and endings, not a stretch of time where humanity seems to fade into the background. But for scientists, that frustration is part of the draw. The gap is an open field for discovery, where any new find has the potential to reshape what we think we know. And sometimes, absence can speak louder than presence. The very scarcity of artifacts from the gap tells us something about the scale of human activity, the size of populations, and the fragility of survival. It tells us that humans were not always the abundant, world-shaping force we are today. There was a time when our presence was faint enough to vanish almost without a trace. The work continues. New technologies like ground-penetrating radar and deep-sea exploration promise to reach places that have been hidden for hundreds of thousands of years. Ancient DNA recovery is improving, allowing scientists to pull genetic material from sediments where no bones remain. Each breakthrough chips away at the edges of the gap, and each edge revealed makes the silence inside more intriguing. In the end, the archaeology of absence is about patience. The gap will not be filled overnight, or perhaps ever. But every tool found, every bone fragment, every reconstructed climate map is a step toward understanding. The void is not empty, it is simply waiting to be read. In the next section, we will step back from the scientific lens and return to the human one, to confront the moment when humanity in the gap came closest to disappearing entirely. This chapter, When We Were Almost Not, will draw together everything we've seen so far into the story of how close we came to never existing at all. We like to think of our existence as inevitable, as though humanity was always destined to stand where it does now. But the million-year gap tells a harsher truth. There were moments when we almost didn't make it. Moments when the thread of our lineage stretched so thin it could have snapped with the smallest tug. Genetic evidence suggests that during this long silence, our population shrank to perilously low numbers, perhaps only a few thousand breeding individuals across the entire planet. A single volcanic winter could have ended us. A prolonged drought might have erased every group in one unlucky region. Even the loss of one generation in a key population could have been enough to silence our species forever. Imagine standing in such a world. The land is vast, but your people are few. Days pass without seeing another human outside your small band. Each hunt is a gamble. Each injury is a potential death sentence. A sudden sickness could sweep through and take your elders, your hunters, your children. There are no reinforcements, no distant settlements to send aid. You are alone. These were not just theoretical risks. The Toba supereruption, about 74,000 years ago, long after the gap's beginning but within its closing arc, is thought by some to have reduced human numbers dramatically. While debate continues over how severe the impact was, events like it almost certainly happened earlier in the gap. Disasters on such a scale could erase whole populations, leaving scattered survivors to carry on with diminished knowledge and resources. The vulnerability wasn't just environmental. Small, isolated groups face genetic risks as well. Inbreeding can weaken resilience to disease and reduce fertility. Loss of genetic diversity means less ability to adapt to sudden changes. In evolutionary terms, a species in this state walks a razor's edge, one misstep and the line ends. And yet, somehow, the line didn't end. Why? Perhaps it was luck. Certain groups living in regions spared the worst effects of climate swings or natural disasters. Perhaps it was adaptability, the ability to change hunting strategies, diets, and habitats faster than the challenges closed in. Perhaps it was connection. rare but critical exchanges of people and ideas between distant groups, keeping the genetic pool and cultural knowledge alive. These survivors were not living in comfort. Their resilience was built in hardship, moving camp when the land failed them, learning to read new skies and seasons, finding food where others starved. Every skill they developed, toolmaking, fire-keeping, tracking, foraging, was a survival mechanism first, a tradition second. And every one of those skills had to be passed down, or it would be lost when the person who knew it died. The emotional cost is harder to measure, but just as real. In a world of scarcity, grief could be deadly. The loss of a single skilled hunter might mean a winter of hunger. The death of a fire keeper could mean nights without warmth. Every absence would be felt in the body as much as the heart. When we speak of these times as a bottleneck, it is easy to picture the data, the narrowing line of a genetic graph, and forget the reality it represents. Lives lived in the constant shadow of not knowing if tomorrow would come. And yet, despite this, our ancestors did more than survive. They carried forward the knowledge, the will, and the adaptability that would one day ignite the burst of creativity we see at the gap's far edge. In this way, the million-year gap was not just a silence, it was a crucible. It burned away everything that could not endure. Only the strongest, most adaptable, and most cooperative lineages emerged on the other side. We are their descendants, shaped by a trial so long and severe we barely understand it. It's humbling to think that we stand here today because of a chain of survival decisions made by people whose names will never be known. A mother who kept her child alive through a harsh winter, a small band that risked crossing a dangerous river to reach new hunting grounds, a fire kept burning in a cave through weeks of storm. These moments, multiplied across thousands of years, were the stitches that kept the fabric of humanity from unraveling. And yet, the possibility of almost not lingers in our blood. It's in the genetic scars of bottlenecks past. It's in the deep-seated human instincts for cooperation, caution, and adaptability. We may have left the million-year gap behind, but the lessons it carved into us remain. When we look back across that chasm of time, we're not just seeing an absence in the record. We're looking at the knife's edge our species balanced on, and the improbable fact that we did not fall. In the next and final section, The Mirror in the Gap, we will turn that truth toward the present, asking what this forgotten age can teach us now, in our own era of shifting climates, fragile systems, and uncertain futures. When we first looked into the million-year gap, it seemed like a hole in the story, a blank space in the record, a silence between two chapters. Now, standing at the far side of it, we can see it differently. It was never empty. It was a mirror that reflects not only where we came from, but where we are now. The people who lived in that long span of shadow did not know they were living in an age we would one day call a gap. They knew only their own days, the hunger or abundance, the seasons, the faces around their fires. They were not working toward some grand destiny, they were surviving, one choice at a time. And yet, in doing so, they shaped the humans we became. We often measure progress in inventions, monuments, written records. By that scale, the gap looks like stasis. But the truth is subtler. The gap honed the invisible qualities, adaptability, cooperation, resilience, without which the later bursts of culture and technology would never have been possible. It is the quiet work beneath the surface that makes the visible flourish possible. The mirror also shows us fragility. We tend to think of humanity as unshakable now, a force so large it bends the planet to its will. But in the gap we were almost gone, reduced to scattered pockets, our survival balanced on the edge of chance. It doesn't take much imagination to see echoes of that precarity in our own age, shifting climates, dwindling resources, the fragility of systems we depend on but rarely question. The difference is that now, the threats we face are not entirely indifferent forces of nature. Many are of our own making. The lesson the gap offers is not just that survival is possible, but that survival demands humility, the ability to read the signs, adapt before the change becomes unlivable, and value the cooperative bonds that keep groups alive. The people who lasted through the gap did not do so by standing alone. There is another reflection here too, patience. The gap lasted 1,000,000 years. No individual could comprehend its full span, just as no one today can truly grasp the sweep of deep time. Change in that world could be so slow that a lifetime might pass without visible transformation. And then, without warning, a flood, a drought, or an eruption could redraw the map overnight. That rhythm, slow, 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 sudden, is one we still live with, whether in nature or in history. Perhaps most of all, the mirror shows us the value of memory. The gap stripped away nearly every physical trace of its people, yet something of them remains, in our DNA, in the instincts wired into our nervous systems, perhaps even in the faint echoes of story and myth. We carry them forward every time we adapt, endure, or imagine beyond the limits of our present moment. In the archaeological record, the gap is a darkness between two pools of light. But the darkness is not empty, it is filled with lives, decisions, triumphs, and losses. It holds the sound of footsteps on grass now gone, the glow of fires whose ashes are long cold, the voices of people who spoke languages no one will ever hear again. The fact that we cannot touch them does not mean they are not part of us. And so, the million-year gap becomes something more than an academic puzzle. It becomes a reminder of the scale of our story, and of how easily it could have ended. When we look into that gap, we are not just looking into the past. We are looking into a possibility that still exists, the possibility of loss, and the parallel possibility of endurance. What the people of the gap would think of us, with our towers of glass, our networks that span the globe, our power to shape land and sea, we can only imagine. Perhaps they would see us as gods. Perhaps they would see us as careless children. Perhaps, most likely, they would see us as we truly are, another generation walking our stretch of the path, holding the flame for as long as we can before passing it on. The gap is over, but its lessons are not. We are still playing the same game, still rolling the same dice, still making choices that will determine whether our line continues far into the future, or whether one day another species will look back on us as a shadow between two chapters. In that sense, the million-year gap is not just behind us. It is beside us, always, as a quiet reminder, a mirror we cannot afford to turn away from.